Gary Talks. I am here with my slavery in the USA, an overview of slavery in the USA. Um, I have worked on this since July. I started it in July. I just was suddenly got really interested in the legacy of slavery in America, the ways that slavery and the institution of owning people, how that has really affected the way that we understand labor in this country, the way that we understand human rights in this country, the way that we understand black people in this country, the way that we understand white people in this country, power in this country, all of those things. The story that I'm trying to tell with this, because the point is not to just be like, oh, like let's shit on the USA and America sucks. Like, I mean, yeah, I kind of think it sucks. But the point more so is just for me, I wanted to highlight what I learned that blew my mind about the way that slavery was incorporated, like slavery, the institution was incorporated culturally and systematically into the laws, policies, and traditions of America. I think it's really fascinating and annoying when people are like, oh, slavery was a long time ago. Like, what you talking about? Why are we still talking about that? Let's see, how long ago was it? 2020, it's 1865. It was 155 years ago. The institution of slavery, if we're talking from when most people count 1619 as when slaves first arrived in, or enslaved Africans first arrived in Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia, until 1865, which is the Emancipation Proclamation, which is when people were technically freed, except for criminals. That's 246 years of slavery versus the 155 that we currently have of freedom. Okay, so there's actually been more slavery in this place than there has been freedom. So let's talk about that, right? If we want to talk about from now until when America was founded, 1776, right? That's 244 years. 244 years of this country being founded. And let's say we don't want to start from 16, because I remember reading this article once that was like, oh, like we can't count American history from starting before 1776 because like, like they didn't know yet. So there was still 157 years of overlap from 1619 to 1776 where they could have made different decisions but instead solidified and really grew the practice of slavery, right? So my point is kind of just to talk about slavery was really important. It's not important to the economy because that's like a really big part and that's what people tend to focus on. It wasn't just about that. It was just like the way that human beings were defined out of manhood and also how racial difference was created and solidified through policy, through science. I think it's really important for us to be clear about that and to understand why, and to understand like what you learned in school was some basic ass shit depending on who you were learning from and where you're going to school. Because I know for me, I went to pretty decent schools and I never really learned about slavery, not in the way that I decided to do independent research and found out so much more. And we definitely learned about it from a very detached, like, oh yeah, the slaves, they came over almost like they on a cruise and they came here and worked and yeah, they were mistreated and brutalized and tortured and forced to work against their will. And then, then they were freed. There was a war, they were freed, and then civil rights, and we're here. Like, do we ever at any point really stop moment to moment to think about what it must be like to be the first African to have gotten snatched off the coast, or to be sold, or to get on that damn ship, or to get off the ship? Do you know what it's like to actually be on a slave ship? Do we actually allow ourselves to hold space to understand and not only conceptualize, but feel into what it must have been like to be a slave? And I think, obviously, yes, the past is the past. Why would we just like sit in the past and simmer and all of this shit? Like, why? It's like, it's miserable. It's uncomfortable. I think it's important for us to understand the land in which we are moving around in. I think it's really important for us to understand this land that we consider so great, home of the free, land of the free, home of the brave. And I want to know who. And when people out here talking about keep America great or make America great again, I really want to know, to which point are you talking about? Which part? The all I cover in the whole thing is from 1501 to the end of the Civil War, and then I had other things planned for Jim Crow and such. So it's not a comprehensive, and this is only focusing on slavery. So I'm not even talking about indigenous Americans or indigenous folks in the Americas, and I'm also not talking about slavery in the Caribbean because that was a whole different experience. Of the 10 million people, Africans that were taken and bought from Africa, about, I want to say like lowest 4%, top 20% made it to the US of A, or the colonies. The rest of them were going to the Caribbean, right? So I guess we can hop on in. In 1501, slaves arrived to the Americas for the first time. They go to Santo Domingo. It was the New World's first international slave port, that is in the Dominican Republic. In 1522, there was a slave revolt in Hispaniola. The rebellion was crushed. I actually found this person who wrote a history of 250 revolts throughout time. I want to, eventually when I make this a digital timeline, which someone put me onto, thank you, I'm going to include all those rebellions. But these are, I wanted to speak mostly about how the culture and legislation has shifted to involve and include and uphold slavery and its ideals. Okay, in 1562, John Hawkins, who's this English naval commander, establishes Great Britain as a leader in the slave trade. So I'm going to show you this little picture here. The slave trade, bow. So you see here, we have, I guess we'll start in Africa, right? In Africa, they're getting the slaves, bringing them over to the New World. I guess you can use my finger here. Taking the slaves from Africa, taking them into the New World to harvest raw materials. The raw materials then go to Europe to be produced and manufactured, which then are sold again into to African tribes to get more slaves, and then the cycle continues. So that's the triangular slave trade that we know about. And that was a pretty big part of like how the slaves came over. In 1619, the first 20 enslaved Africans arrive in Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia, off of a British ship. I think it's off of a British ship. Yeah, called the White Lion. And I don't know if they were bought or stolen from Portuguese from slavers, but that's when the first recorded Africans are showing up in America as slaves. Because there were black people showing up before, but these are the first slaves that came. In 1641, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which is the first legal code established in this new world, legalizes slavery. So about 20 years after the first slaves arrive, slavery is legalized as an institution. This is something that we do. In the New World, we do that. Okay? In 1662, Virginia law, which is also a Virginia law, also referenced as partus sequitur ventrum, which means the offspring follows the belly, decrees that children shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother. So if your mom was a slave, you are a slave. This is now and now we see how slavery is becoming hereditary, right? It's not just like I bought this person to do work. It's like I bought this thing and it will continue to produce things that I can sell to other people and also continue to use as my means of production. It made the children of enslaved mothers slaves for life. This law also relieved a lot of white fathers of financial responsibility to their offspring that they had from raping black women, black slaves. Because if a slave, let's talk about the difference between a slave and a servant, right? Because there was a lot of indentured servitude coming into the New World. That's how things got done. A lot of people were, and a servant, an indentured servant, has like a time period of working. So let's say like 7 years, they agreed with this person who's employing them. You're pretty much at this person's mercy and whim for 7 years. Your master could be nice and kind, or they could be a dickhead and a jerk and violent and sadistic. But you pretty much are at this person's beck and call. You're their domestic worker. So like watching their kids, washing their shit, making their food, harvesting their crops, etc. And for a certain amount of time, then after that time, you are freed. Right? With slaves, there's no opportunity for freedom. This is your duty. And when I think about slavery in indigenous cultures or white history, because people like to be like, oh, well, Africans had slaves and Native American people had warfare. Yes, I'm not very fully well versed in the going-ons of that, but from what I have read and seen, a lot of times when there were if there was warfare, and the prisoners of war, so the people who lost, would become slaves. They would become workers. But it was never, from what I understood, like, you and your people are slavery, like, that's all y'all are good for. You know, like, you lost because you're an inferior race than us. It would be like, you lost because your warfare is not that fire. Like, our warfare is fire, so now you join us because you're weak. You got conquered, so join us, right? And there's obviously all these things about, like, conquerors and stuff. I'm not going to get into all of these things. However, again, I just want to highlight that in America, there was very much this hereditary flavor to it. This, like, you are a slave because you were created for that. Just like Adam and Eve, like Adam in the garden was created to, like, domesticate and name all the critters. I think it's very interesting how a lot of the Europeans use that same logic of them being Adam to name everything and give everything a purpose. And give that to the black man and woman and the black body in America. So, just really interesting. So 1662, if your mama was a slave, you were born a slave. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, this is a very, very, very interesting piece of history to me. So this dude named Nathaniel Bacon, he was a wealthy he was a landowner. I don't think he was so he's not part of the planter elite. So the planter elite are the people, it's like when we think about currently, like, the 1%, like 1% of the population having the most amount of money and owning most of the means of production and making up such a small part of the population. It's just like the way that power is consolidated. So back then, same thing. There was people who owned huge plantations. Because a lot of the thing, like, not all Southerners, even at the peak of slavery, it's not like all Southerners were plantation owners. There was a lot of poor white people around that did not have plantations, that did not have slaves. They were just working alongside these people who did have plantations, right? So Nathaniel Bacon is not of this elite class. He's not of the 1%. He's wealthy, or he's rich, but maybe he's not wealthy. He came from London, and he was given a seat on the council from his cousin-in-law, Governor Sir William Berkeley. These two did not get along. Really, they didn't get along on how they wanted to treat indigenous people. Nathaniel Bacon wanted to expand westward and murk all the natives along the edge of Virginia and get that land for himself, right? And Governor Berkeley was like, nah, like, we don't have the means to engage in warfare with them, because if we engage with one group, they all gonna be upset when we trying to go into their shit, right? And also, like, he's trying to be like, we're good as the planter elite. Don't come in here trying to make changes. When I first learned about Bacon's Rebellion, I was actually, like, kind of touched, right? Because it's the first time black and white indentured servants and slaves are coming together. So all these poor people, the people of the working class, the people who are the means of production, who are making the society do a thing, they all come together to protest and to rebel against the planter elite and the government, the House of Burgesses at the time. However, when I come to read about it, because they're doing this banding together to pursue land that is not theirs. So you got me fucked up. But what I wrote here, and it ultimately his rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion, falls apart because he gets sick and falls apart, or he dies, and the whole thing just dissolves. And really, the importance of this is the after effect. I would call this the moment that black and white were really invented in this country. I have written here from a source. So I found this source called facinghistory.org. So good. I really, really enjoy the way that they frame their things. But to protect their superior status and economic position, the wealthy planters abandoned their heavy reliance on white indentured servants in favor of the importation of more black slaves. So soon after Bacon's Rebellion, they increasingly distinguish between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves, and they increasingly give some power to independent white farmers and landholders. Now, what is interesting, this is by this saying right here is historian Ira Berlin is saying this. Now, what is interesting about this is that we normally say that slavery and freedom are opposite things, that they are diametrically opposed, as in like freedom's here and slavery's on the side. But what we see here in Virginia in the late 17th century around Bacon's Rebellion is that freedom and slavery are created at the same moment. It's important to note in 1671 is like the first time where the word white is used to describe a white man. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, that's when they put it down. So you see, prior to like the 1600s or 1671, early 1600s, early 1700s, people not really being spoken about as white until then. It's like a conscious decision to start separating them out. Reading here further from historian Robert D.G. Kelly says, many of the European descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery. Okay? So there's the reason that we have to understand about white and black and why white is desirable is because it's not that. It's not those slavery people, those people who are enslaved, those people who got themselves enslaved, who are in this country doing work because we said so, because that's who we have, how we have determined their status. Okay, so it's after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 that this becomes like a more widely practiced and spread ideology. So for instance, in 1691. Virginia passes their first anti-miscegenation law. Miscegenation meaning mixing. So whites and non-whites can't get married. Okay. It also in 1691 there's an anti-manumission law. So manumission means freeing an owner freeing their slave. So if an owner freed their slave, that act is called manumission. Virginia starts getting involved. They pass laws that are like, we need to be involved. We need to know when you're freeing people. We want to know how many free people there are and how many slaves there are out here. And they, in fact, they de-incentivize freeing slaves, right? By making, in this law here, they required a newly freed slave to leave the colony within 6 months, and the former master has to pay for the trip. Why? Now, why the hell would I do that? Unless I'm really passionate about my slave being freed, right? Most people are not. They're like, whatever, bro. So we gonna keep going, because I'm not trying to pay that. And you see how the government, like how the law is just so involved in this. They're the ones passing these rules. Why is there a rule that black and white people can't get together? Interesting, right? So in 1694, rice becomes a cash crop, initially booming in like South Carolina, and that rice is a really, really delicate cultivation process, and so they need a lot of bodies for that. So they start importing a lot of slaves. In 1708 in South Carolina, there's actually more enslaved Africans than there are European Americans. 1738, Spanish Florida, so Spain owns Florida, they promise freedom to runaway slaves. It's funny because a lot of Spanish, you'll see in history too, a lot of the times when the Spanish are offering freedom, it's kind of like a jab at the British, like, come join us and be free and fuck them English bastards. This is like kind of a power move, but it is just important to note that they do they became a safe haven for free blacks for the next like 80 years, and people really flocked to Florida to seek freedom. So actually the next year, 1739, this was really cool to learn about and tragic too, Stono's Rebellion. This guy named, I guess, it's hard with these facts in these stories because they're from so long ago. People are passing down stories, oral tradition, and a lot of these rebellions are not documented. Actually, yeah, a lot of these things are not documented because at the time, white people don't want to spread the terror, and it's just interesting too when we think about Native Americans. A lot of the time when we hear the stories about Indigenous Americans, it's like about the Trail of Tears or like all these really horrible, sad moments in their history versus like the times that they were fighting the fuck back and murking and defending their lands. Okay, and there's a reason why that legacy is that way. Okay, so keep that in mind too. I tried to put in the rebellions as I could, but I want to spend the time to actually study all the rebellions and put them in. So yes, this guy Jemmy, he's an enslaved African. He leads a group of about 20 slaves towards Spanish Florida. They're marching, they screaming freedom. They burn 6 plantations on the way. I think they kill about 20 slave masters and their families. And eventually the group, I think within 2 days, grows to include like 60 to 80 slaves. That's very scary for white people in charge, right? So the militia gets involved and for I think they're like back and forth for about a week until they're like crushed. The rebellion is crushed. In the conflict, about 40 Africans were killed, enslaved Africans were killed, and I don't know if 20 whites were killed on top of the 20 whites that were killed initially. I don't think so. It is known as one of the biggest slave revolts in the North American colonial period. And in response to the rebellion, the South Carolina legislature enacts this next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the Negro Act of 1740, immediately, right? Which restricts slave assembly, education, and movement. So the Negro Act of 1740 was created, like I just said, in direct response to Stonewall's Rebellion. Stonewall's Rebellion pretty much confirmed most people's fear, which is like, yo, these black people, if we let them out here, if we let them get together, all they're going to talk about is rebelling. And what I want to note and what has been infuriating about this history, documenting it and reading it, is just like the way that indigenous Americans and black people are spoken about. Like, threats from natives were always imminent, and like threats of slave uprisings were always like, and then there's also this element of like feeling bad for the masters and families that are killed, right? Because I'm not here for violence. I don't want to see children getting killed, and I don't want to see women getting killed. And also, I'm not gonna sit here and be like, oh, I feel bad, or I feel more sorrow for the master than I do for the reason why they got killed. Like, again, I don't want to, I'm not condoning violence and being like, oh, so, people are, because they're oppressed, they have complete justification to go kill other people. And also, like, it has been, at this point, 120 years of slavery. And how do you, and something I constantly say and ask is like, how do you speak to a system that has no ears? When violence is the language that your system speaks, what other language is there to speak to you? And it's just crazy and really disgusting to me to just see how they speak about these uprisings. As not like I feel like uprisings would be a pretty normal thing. Because if you enslaving a bunch of people and they're not about it, but it's like the history, even when you're reading it, it's like they want you to feel ashamed for that being the thing, and like take the side of the owner, like, oh, how dare these uprisings happen? Like, and I don't agree. I just wanted to note that. So in the Negro Act of 1740, also known as the Bill for Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes, South Carolina passes this thing that pretty much like really solidifies African slaves or enslaved African people as human cargo, chattel, and revokes a lot of their civil rights. So for instance, the Negro Act of 1740 made it illegal for more than 7 Black men to gather outside the presence of a white man. White and indigenous Americans were offered rewards for hunting fugitive slaves. It was illegal to teach slaves to write. Slaves were forbidden from striking any white person except in defense of their master. This is punishable by death. And white owners are authorized to whip and kill enslaved Africans for being rebellious, right? And it was crazy to me reading these things and being like, they put it down. They really wrote it down. And people really participated in this. Like, it was illegal to teach slaves to write, so they didn't. And if you did, you would get in trouble as a white man. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The first abolitionist party is founded in 1775. In 1776, Vermont banned slavery, which is cool. That's also the year that we got, our independence. So we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created equal and we all have unalienable rights given to us by our Creator, said Thomas Jefferson before he went home to his 175 slaves. Then we have, I'm skipping ahead again to, now we're like pretty far ahead, 40 years in advance. 1788, the Fugitive Slave Clause and the 3/5 Compromise. So slavery is still legal. It's being banned slowly in different places. So like in 1758, the Quakers banned slavery. Vermont banned slavery. But even when the 13 colonies declared independence in 1776, none of them at that time had yet outlawed slavery. So Vermont did it after the Declaration of Independence. Like, oh, I guess let's catch up to that. So anyway, in 1788, the Fugitive Slave Clause and 3/5 Compromise starts happening, right? So the Fugitive Slave Clause, in case you're curious, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, allowed a slave who flees to another state, even if it is a free state, to be returned to the owner in the state from which the slave escaped. So no matter how far you go, no matter where you go, you are allowed to be taken back in the Constitution. Okay? Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 determined that enslaved blacks in a state would be counted as 3/5 of the number of white inhabitants of that state on the U.S. Census. And we know population influences things such as how many representatives you get in the House, or how many delegates a state has in the House of Representatives. So how many representatives you would have. Seems like there's certain people being barred from participation. Okay. 1790, there's a naturalization ban. Congress grants citizenship, which is property ownership, representation in the courts, public employment, and voting to any alien being a free white person. Meaning Europeans coming in, citizenship. We passing them out. Asian people coming in, black people, because technically aren't they aliens if they're coming outside of the country? No, too bad. Nope. Y'all not allowed to do that. Y'all are not citizens, and I want that to be clear. And again, in the Constitution. 1792, there's an army service ban. This stops African Americans from being in military service, and this continues until the Civil War. However, of course, anytime the country needs them, they're there, right? War of 1812, blacks are technically not allowed to be there, but why 3,000 of them are deployed, right? Because I didn't mention this too, but in 1770, so this is before all of the independence stuff, Crispus Attucks, which is the first, he was an African and indigenous American who was killed during the Boston Massacre and is noted as like the first colonist to die in the war for independence. And it's just like, black people and black bodies are welcome to die for this place, but they're not gonna get no credit though. You still out here being hunted, right? So if you're free and it's just like, I guess, right, because if it's just like how much property is justified, right? Because if we think of people as property, which is what they're calling us to do when we think about slaves, if a slave flees for their freedom, property law rules. It's like, nah, but we couldn't bring them back because you got to work. What you're talking about? Work is more important than your humanity. In 1800. There was this enslaved literate blacksmith named Gabriel who organized a major revolt in Virginia, and he was really about to be out there. There was supposed to be a lot of people involved, but there was a really crazy rainstorm, like rain that people at the time said they had never seen before, and then there was also a traitor, and his plans fell apart. And fearing future uprisings, Gabriel and 25 others were hung. Also, I didn't mention this, but after Stono's Rebellion, they were also executed. The people who were involved were executed, and also like heads cut off and put on sticks, like don't you dare try this shit again, right? And I think I don't think we really sit with the amount of violence that really was used to get people in line. So states start passing a lot of legislation limiting the movement of free blacks, as well as maintaining the lack of mobility with slaves, and no education, no assembly, and slaves can't. So the slaves used to be able to like go to different places and be hired out to do work, almost like an internship, like a real fucked up internship. But they stopped doing that because they're like, oh, when you go over there, you getting all these crazy ideas from somebody that you like, and nah, we can't have you, free thinking and mobilizing and organizing. Interestingly enough, too, Virginia governor at the time, James Monroe, who also I believe is one of our presidents, he creates the Richmond Public Guard, aka the Richmond Police. And this is where I want us to take a moment to be like, oh, right, because the police is part of, right, policing particular bodies, policing particular communities, ensuring the safety of other communities. Okay? In 1804 is the Haitian Revolution. It's when it's completed, when they got their their freedom. It started in 1791. It was about, I think, 13 years of revolting. Also in that same year, the first documented activity in what became the Underground Railroad begins in Pennsylvania. The Haitian Revolution also marked as a huge, just like, people knew about that. And it's just so funny to me too, how you can try to stop news, you can try to stop people from having information. However, just because these people can't read or write doesn't mean that they can't listen. And also there are still people who read, like slaves reading and writing, who are now spreading information. Like, the Haitian Revolution was huge news for people because it was a nation. And something that I read that was really cool and interesting and fascinating to me is just like, a lot of revolutions and revolts were happening in other places, like around the Americas, not only in the colonies, but also in Caribbean America, or in the Caribbean. But they're more densely populated by slaves. So the Caribbean is like 90% slave population, versus here, even when white people were in the minority, they had enough force and enough support from the police and from other groups that could come through that they would squash every revolt that happened, or a lot of the revolts that would happen in the colonized states, the 13 colonies. So the Haitian Revolution really blew it wide open for people, and it was a source of inspiration for a lot of slaves. And then I want to end here in 1807. The slave trade is officially banned. It's outlawed. The act prohibiting importation of slaves mandates that no new slaves are to be imported into the United States. So it outlaws the slave trade, even though, again, let's say from 1519, when I started this timeline, to 1807, 10 million Africans have left Africa to go to the Caribbean and to the 13 colonies. And this is when they're finally saying, hey, no more slave trade, but slavery continues to happen. Okay, first of all, slaves continue to still be imported, but it's not like this mass trade that is allowed. However, and I will say one more time, slavery itself is not outlawed. And I will also note, this is on a different note, I will say this, and this is all I had posted, so I'm going to do the other pages tomorrow. But what I wanted to say is, I watched this TED education video, the TED Lessons video, about the slave trade and its like effects in America and in Africa. And it broke down slavery in such a powerful way in regards to it being an arms race. So again, I want us to like take a moment to like imagine being the first Africans, right, to encounter white captains with their goods. They come in here with sugar. They come in here with cigarettes and like different forms of tobacco. They come in here with linens that they've gotten from the East. They're coming with spices that they stole from everywhere else. They got rum. And so, and they have guns, right? I know the first time I've ever seen a gun, I was appalled by the power of it, right? Imagine never having seen a gun, period, and this thing booms, a mini cannon in somebody's hands. And I'm sure there was some sort of demonstration that the captains brought to these African ports. And again, too, the reason they even went to Africa in the first place, pause, right? Because the colonists went to the New World, they met the Native Americans, they freaking killed a lot of the Native Americans because of violence and also because of their dirtiness. The bubonic plague had happened in Europe. It didn't happen everywhere in the world. It happened in Europe with them dirty ass hands and dirty ass habits. They bringing their immunity, because you know when you get sick, if you get better, you are stronger. Survival of the fittest in that way. They come here. These people's immune systems, the indigenous people, they don't know how to handle that, so they're dying, and they're trying to get them to do this work. The colonists are trying to get the natives to do this work. They don't work like that. They dying. So they decide to go to Africa. So they come with all their goods, they come with their guns, and people are like, imagine seeing a gun go off and being like, I don't have a gun, and this white man has a gun. He has many guns. I need a gun to protect myself, right? And they're like, all right, I'll trade you some guns for some people. And so now it's crazy how people become currency. So now we have tribes acquiring guns to defend themselves from other tribes trying to steal people from them, and also to increase their ability to steal people from other tribes as well. Because there was warfare before, and again, the slaves would happen because prisoners of war, but it was never like we were out here trying to get slaves, but now they're out here trying to get slaves to satisfy the European demand for human bodies in this currency exchange, right? They're exchanging protection and arms for people. And the reason I bring up all of this is because in 1807, when the slave trade is outlawed, a lot of African economies had been set up on slavery at this point. Because the colonists were capturing and kidnapping people, but they were also buying people, right? And so in 1807, when all of these economies that have been built up on human currency, on selling and exchanging humans, now it's collapsed. And 10 million of their people are overseas. Some of them died in the ocean, some of them in the U.S., or what ultimately becomes the U.S., some of them in the Caribbean. The country is left vulnerable and unstable, and so they collapse. And that's why, the reason I'm pointing over there is and that's why Africa looks like that. All them colors split up by everybody who came to carve it up as they so chose, right? That's what I got for y'all today. I'm hoping that it has been conveyed. This just like the way that slavery has been really woven into the laws. And yes, things change, and we as a peoples we forgive, right? We grow and we move forward. However, I think it's really important to note that at 1776, when everybody was supposed to be created equal, we already had slaves. So you've been lying. We've been lying, and they've been lying to us about this shit. Because what is equal if there's not everybody who's equal? We the people has never meant we the people. There's this dude, Mark Charles. Y'all should check him out. He was running for president while that was happening. And he had this campaign that's like, I want to make we the people mean we the people. But first, let's talk about how we the people has never meant we the people. We the people has just meant we the white man who own land. And that's what so much of this has been about, defending those people's rights. The people who own production, the capitalists who first came here, seeking religious freedom, yet persecuting everybody else. And I just also hope we're hearing at least the constant justification of this. Like, oh, slaves aren't allowed to rebel. Like, what are you talking about? That's crazy and violent. But we're not going to talk about the institution of slavery, period. You get what I'm saying? So that's what I wanted to say. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you so much for listening. I know this was like a lengthy video and really intense. But I felt important to share. So here I am. And if y'all have any questions or anything like that, hit me up. I'm going to come up continually with more ways to like make this more engaging too. Because like I want to make it like not funny, because like it's not funny, but also we learn through humor. And my humor can be real dark, so eventually I do want to make like short videos, maybe animated videos, or do voiceovers of things. But for now, this is what I got. So thanks for tuning in and spending time learning with me.